So I'll start introducing Simon while he's setting up. So Simon Baron-Cohen is a professor of developmental psychopathology here in University of Cambridge, and he's also a fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge. He's director of the Autism Research Center in Cambridge. He has a degree in human sciences from New College, Oxford, a PhD in psychology from UCL, an MPhil in clinical psychology at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College, London, and he held lectureships in these departments. He's author of Mind Blindness, The Essential Difference, Prenatal Testosterone in Mind, and 0 Degrees of Empathy. He has edited scholarly anthologies including Understanding Other Minds, Synesthesia, and The Maladapted Mind. He has written books for parents and teachers including Autism and Asperger's Syndrome, The Facts, and Teaching Children with Autism to Mind Read. He has celebrated autism in an exact mind. He's also the author of the DVDs Mind Reading and the Transporters to help children with autism learn emotion recognition, both nominated for BAFTA awards. He's an author of over 450 scientific articles, and he has supervised many, many PhD students. In 1985, he formulated and went on to test the mind blindness theory of autism. In 1997, he formulated and went on to test the fetal sex theory of autism. He has also made contributions to the fields of autism prevalence and screening, autism genetics, autism neuroimaging, autism and technical ability, typical cognitive sex differences, and synesthesia. In 1999, Baron-Cohen created the first UK clinic for adults with suspected Asperger's syndrome called the Class Clinic, Cambridge Lifespan Asperger's Syndrome Service, at a time when the National Health Service did not see the clinical need for this. This has helped over 1,000 patients to have their disability recognized and lost generation of adults who had missed out on diagnosis in childhood and has been used to create a model for similar clinical services all over the UK. He has received many awards from the British Psychological Society, the Spearman Medal, the American Psychological Association, McCandless Award, the BPS, Davison Award, the Autism Award Philadelphia. I actually cannot count all of them, but I'm trying to go through as many as possible. The British Association for the Advancement of Science, Joseph Lister Lecturer, the Lifetime Achievement Award, Mensa, and Kanner Asperger Medal from the German Society for Research into Autism. He's a fellow of the BPS, the British Academy, and the American Psychological Association. He's vice president of the National Autistic Society, Autism Anglia, and he was president of the psychology section of the British Association and vice president of the International Society for Autism Research. He also was chair of the NICE Guideline Development Group for Autism Adults. He's also scientific advisor or patron to 6 autism charities and a member of the Department of Health Program Board Autism Strategy. He is chair of the psychology section of the British Academy, and he's co-editor-in-chief of the journal Molecular Autism and on the editorial board of many journals, including the Lancet Psychiatry. He's an Andrew D. White Professor at Large, Cornell University, and received Doctor of Science degrees from Roehampton University and Abertay University. He is president-elect of INSAR and a National Institute of Health Research senior investigator. So a lot of achievements. So let's welcome Simon, and I'm going to pass my microphone to him. Thank you very much for coming, Simon.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be at the conference. Too much information in the
I had to fill in the time.
in the introduction, but it's a very generous introduction. So I wish you all a very successful conference. My keynote talk is about autism. Is it sounding okay? It sounds a little like there's an echo from where I am. What can we do in terms of the audio? Okay, Let's try that. Is that a bit better? I think so. So this is a conference on affective computing, and I'm not a specialist in that field. And you'll be hearing a little bit later from Ros Pickard, who is. I'm an expert in any subject. It would be autism, because I've been studying autism for many years. So what I thought I would do is just explain latest research into what we understand about autism, and then show you some of the work we've done to use computers to help autistic children or adults to recognize emotions. But I hope that will be a nice sort of opening to the conference. So many of you know what autism is, but this picture, I think, just sums up some of the key characteristics. We see a child, in this case a boy, and we'll hear that autism affects boys much more often than girls, playing alone, and autism is very much a disability that makes socializing challenging. But you can also see that he is lining up his cars in very clear order and sequence, and autistic people love order, they love patterns, they love logic. So we see a kind of a medical condition, because as we'll explore, this has its roots in biology, that affects recognizing emotions, very relevant to the conference, but also just changes the way that the brain is developing, the way that the mind is developing, with a much stronger slant towards pattern recognition and logic. I've painted autism so far as if that's all there is to say, but actually autism comes in many varieties. And many autistic people don't just have the social disability or the communication disability that I mentioned, and this love of patterns, but they may also have other, sometimes called comorbid or co-occurring conditions, like epilepsy in a minority, learning difficulties or disabilities, so general learning difficulties in a substantial minority, really some quite distressing symptoms like self-injury. A proportion of them have very little language. Some of them have very clear medical issues like gastrointestinal pain. So autism is complex, but these are co-occurring symptoms or conditions. They're not universally seen in autism. And these days, of course, we talk about the spectrum. In fact, the term spectrum has almost become synonymous with the term autism. And back in 2001, our group decided to see whether we could measure this spectrum, because although the term was out there, it hadn't really been quantified. So we developed the Autism Spectrum Quotient, the AQ, that many of you may have found on the web. If you Google how to measure autistic traits. And what you can see, this is a questionnaire that people can fill in for themselves. There's also a parent version that parents can fill in about their child. But what you can see in the dotted line is the bell curve of autistic traits that we see in the population. So this isn't autism, it's autistic traits. And the idea is that we all have these traits. And then the solid line are the number of traits that you see in people with a diagnosis of autism. So, what's striking is that there's an overlap between the two groups, those with and without a diagnosis. There's no clear-cut point where you could say this person has autism and this person doesn't. It really is a spectrum of traits that runs right through the population. What we've seen in recent years is that many more children and indeed adults are getting diagnosed with autism. So this shows you data from 2002 through 2010 from the US. There's more recent data showing this steady increase. And you can see that this is true across different income brackets, socioeconomic classes. And this probably just reflects better recognition, better awareness, so that we're approaching recognizing the kind of true proportion of people who need a diagnosis. So the first part of my talk is going to be just summarizing what we understand about the causes of autism, and then I'll move into the application of affective computing. But we now know that autism is partly genetic. I say partly because we'll go on to see that it's not completely genetic, but we know it's partly genetic because you can do family studies and find that if there's one child with autism in the family, the likelihood of other children in the family also having autism is much higher than the general population rate. So the general population rate of autism is about 1%, but in families where there's already one child with autism, the likelihood of the next child also having autism jumps up to about 30%. So this is telling us that autism runs in families. Doesn't clearly prove genetics, but it shows that it runs in families. And molecular geneticists have gone beyond family studies to actually look at the DNA and found, well, this is from a website called safari.org, which constantly updates every time there's a new genetic study that reports an association with autism. So what you can see here is a list of 100 high-confidence genes, many of them expressed in the brain, which is where we would expect to find them. And they're high confidence because they've been identified by more than one lab, so they independently replicate the results. So this is telling us that autism is partly genetic and that it's not a single gene condition. There are many genes at play. In Cambridge, we're looking at families like this to try to help identify genes for autism. So these are kind of the traditional way that you represent pedigrees, where you've got the mother and the father, circles are females, squares are males, so these are the children. So this is a family with 6 children, and shaded in blue are those who have a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. And you can see that the father has a diagnosis, 5 out of 6 of the children have a diagnosis, and the one in yellow is very young and is going through a developmental assessment at the moment. We'll find out if she needs a diagnosis. But when you find families like this, there's really no question that there are genes at play in autism. And we hope that by studying families like this, we've collected now 20 such very informative families to do whole genome sequencing. As you know, these days, even from a saliva sample, you can now look at the whole genome, so looking at every gene that the person carries, to see which genes are more common in families like this compared to families without a diagnosis of autism. Just carrying on this, I think, very important focus on genetics, this pie chart tries to summarize from geneticists the consensus view of how much of autism can be explained by genetics, what proportion of the variants can be explained by genetics. And what you can see is that this little slice here are what are called rare genetic variants. So genetic variants or mutations that only occur very rarely in the population, and that seems to account for about 3% of autism. This big slice of the pie are what are called common genetic variants, so genes that we all carry, but which occur in the population in different varieties, different versions of the gene. And it seems that combinations of common genetic variants that we all might carry may explain up to about half of the variants of autism. So this is still genetics, but they're not rare mutations, they're just common variations in the population. And the idea might be that certain combinations of those genetic variants, they're not disease genes, they're genes that we all carry, might also contribute to the likelihood of autism. And then you can see another big slice of the pie is unaccounted for, and so non-genetic factors, and we'll look at that in a second. So trying to find these very common genetic variants turns out to be very challenging for researchers because each of these very common genetic variants may only play a tiny role, they only may have a tiny effect in pushing somebody towards a likelihood of autism. So what that means is you need very big data, big samples, to be able to identify if one or more of these common genetic variants is associated with autism. So this kind of plot, you'll see this if you go to genetics conferences, is called a Manhattan plot because it resembles the Manhattan skyline. But each of these points along the x-axis are the chromosomes in the human genome, and the red line sets the threshold of significance for saying that something is significantly associated with a condition, so it's a probability estimate. And what you're looking for is whether any of these thousands or millions of genetic variants crosses the red line. And you can see that in this study, published in 2018, they did a genome-wide association study of 18,000 autistic people and 28,000 non-autistic people. So that shows you the kinds of numbers that you need in order to find genes associated with conditions. And they found just 5 common genetic variants that crossed the line. So you could say with some confidence that these are associated with autism. There are other sorts of very big studies like this going on to identify the genetic basis of depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and so forth, all of which have taught us that you need big data to find these common genetic variants. So gone are the days when our group and many other groups around the world would study just a few hundred people and look at their DNA, because many of those so-called candidate gene studies didn't replicate, they didn't provide reliable results. We now understand we need very big data, and that means international collaboration, where groups are working together to collect enough people with a diagnosis to do these sorts of studies. We know that there will be many more than 5 common genetic variants involved in autism, but it's showing that with this kind of sample size, 18,000, you begin to see some of these reliable common genetic variants associated with autism. So far what I've said is that autism is partly genetic. We know it's not completely genetic because of the existence of twins, like these 2 sisters, where one has autism and one doesn't, and yet they are identical twins. So they share all of their genes, and if autism was 100% genetic, if one has it, then the other one should also have it. So the fact that you can find discordant twin pairs, identical twin pairs of this nature, shows that there must be some non-genetic factors, and now scientists are starting to try to understand what are the possible epigenetic factors, factors from the environment that can modify a genetic predisposition to change how that gene functions. And this was a systematic review published in 2017, which started to try to collect some of the non-genetic, the environmental factors that also seem to be associated with autism. I won't go through all of them at length, but you can see that if the mother had diabetes during pregnancy, so that's called gestational diabetes, that seems to increase the likelihood of the baby developing autism. So that's a hormonal change in the mother during pregnancy, changing the uterine environment and presumably affecting brain development in the fetus. Parents' age seems to be another one. So mothers who are older, and indeed fathers who are older at the time that the child is conceived, seems to be another factor that increases likelihood of autism in the child. Birth complications. This one here is maternal BMI, or body mass index, at age 18. So that's really the mother's or the woman's weight at age 18, so maybe long before she has her child, is already a predictor of whether her child is going to have autism. And this actually shows you that the mother's body mass index, this is the likelihood that the child has autism as body mass index increases compared to the likelihood that the child doesn't have autism as body mass increases. So potentially hormonal factors which may not be genetic, may be associated with other factors of the mother's biology. Another sort of finding that's come out in recent years about autism is that a percentage of these kids have large heads. And you can pick this up with, you don't need high technology to identify it. Just an old-fashioned tape measure will indicate that a proportion of these kids have macrocephaly, or large heads. And you can see that this seems to change across early development. So this is showing the first year of life, the typical curve for kids who don't have an autism diagnosis, and the growth curve for kids who end up with an autism diagnosis, that it looks like the brain may be growing faster in a proportion of kids compared, autistic kids, compared to what you'd expect in the typical case. And scientists have now tried to look at the brain more directly, not just looking at head circumference, but looking at the brain volume more directly by doing studies like this. This was published in 2010, but where you take a group of people with autism and a group of people without autism. This shows that the age, but you also do repeat scans. So each child is coming in for at least 2 brain scans, but in some cases more than that. So actually this shows you the number of scans over here. So some of them are having as many as 6 brain scans, so that you can start to plot growth curves as to look at how the child's brain is growing, the rate of growth. And this is just one of the type of results that you get from a study like that. This is typical kids shown in blue, and these are autistic kids shown in red. Across age, so this is now going from the 12 months old to 72 months old, and you can see that you kind of join the dots because everyone's had at least 2 brain scans, so you can start to look at average growth curves. That in autism, the brain seems to be larger at each point, but the rate of growth is also changed in autism. And this larger brain seems to be associated with more neurons in certain parts of the brain. So if we look at the green part, the frontal lobes, this is a study from post-mortem investigations in University of California at San Diego, where they looked at the number of neurons or nerve cells in different parts of the brain, finding that in autism, there are 65% more neurons than you'd expect compared to a typical brain of the same age and gender. So the larger brain may be accounted for by more nerve cells or neurons in the autistic brain. And if we drill down to look at individual nerve cells or neurons, again from post-mortem studies, this wouldn't really be possible using any other method. Here we've got an individual neuron from someone who has autism, and on the left, a typical person, individual neuron, and you can see with the naked eye, I think, some differences, namely that along the length of the nerve cell, the neuron, there are more of these little white dots, and each of those, they're called dendritic spines, is where the neuron forms a connection with its neighbor. So there are not only more neurons in the autistic brain, but also more connections between neurons. And if we just stop and think, what would this evidence from neuropathology translate into if we had autism, if we have autism and we're processing information about the world? It may mean that the autistic brain is picking up more information and having to process a lot more information, which could mean feeling overwhelmed with information if you're autistic, particularly in a fast-changing environment like a social environment where information is changing very rapidly. But it could also mean that you have the ability, the perceptual ability to pick up more detail and maybe identify patterns much more quickly. Those are speculations going from the cellular level all the way to what we might imagine is going on at the psychological level. You can see that using MRI, scientists now have a way of separating what are called long-range connections and short-range connections in the human brain. So long-range connections simply go further, maybe from the back of the brain to the front. Short-range connections are local connections that the brain is making between neighboring areas. And what's been found in this study was that there are more of these short-range connections in the autistic brain compared to people without autism. So this overconnectivity may be between adjacent areas of the brain, suggesting that there might be deeper, richer information processing going on in much more local areas of the brain. I've mentioned that autism is more often diagnosed in boys than in girls. So this study, which again comes from the States, suggests that the sex ratio is about 4 boys for every 1 girl that gets a diagnosis. And that seems to be true across the IQ range. These days, there's a concern that maybe we are missing girls on the spectrum, that maybe clinicians are just less skilled at recognizing autism in girls, and that also that more women and more girls are being referred or seeking a diagnosis, so that the gap may be closing a little bit. And recent studies suggest that the sex ratio may be more like 3 or 2 males for every 1 female. So still apparently a bias towards males, but maybe not as extreme as the earlier studies suggested. And in our lab here in Cambridge, we've been looking to see what might explain the increased likelihood of diagnosis of autism in boys, and looking at the hormone testosterone. Testosterone is produced in higher levels in the male fetus than in the female fetus. And it's also known from animal research to change brain development. So we had the opportunity to measure this hormone, testosterone, during pregnancy in the fluid that surrounds the baby, because many women were choosing to have a clinical procedure called amniocentesis, where a needle is introduced into that fluid. You can sample it, you can measure the hormones, and they were having this for clinical reasons. So as researchers, we were able to piggyback on this clinical procedure to know the child's testosterone levels before they were born, and then by linking it with psychiatric registers, know which of those babies later went on to develop autism. And what we found, as you can see, is that typical males have higher levels than females of prenatal testosterone, and autistic kids have slightly higher levels than people in the general population. So this might be a prenatal hormonal environmental factor that may explain, again, why in individuals who have a genetic predisposition, boys are slightly more likely to end up with a diagnosis of autism. This may also explain, controversially, sex differences that we see in perception in typical boys and girls. So we did this study many years ago now here in Cambridge, where we took babies who were 24 hours old, so first day of life, and presented them with 2 different stimuli, a social stimulus, and this is where we get a bit closer to affective computing, a social stimulus and a non-social stimulus, a geometric design. And we filmed the babies for how long they looked at each kind of stimulus. And what we found was that more girls than boys looked longer at the human face, and more boys than girls looked longer at the geometric design. Plotted here are just the babies that showed a significant discrepancy, either towards the social or the non-social. because there was a proportion of babies who looked equally long at both kinds of stimuli. But finding a difference like this on the first day of life, so before there's been much opportunity for culture to be shaping the human brain, suggests that there may be prenatal biological factors that predispose an infant to be more interested in the social world or more interested in the non-social world, and that this seems to be related to gender. And as we saw earlier, there may be prenatal hormonal factors that might be relevant. Back to autism, at the earliest point you can diagnose autism, which is at about 18 months of age. This study again comes from California, San Diego. If you present the child at 18 months old coming to the clinic with a social stimulus or a non-social stimulus, if the child is spending more than 70% of the time looking at the non-social stimulus, the likelihood that they have autism is 100%. That was a very striking finding, published in 2010, suggesting all you'd need is a behavioral test, maybe to identify who has autism, just from their looking preferences, looking more at faces or objects. Obviously, this test may not be as accurate if you were using it in the general population, because these are children coming to a clinic anyway, where someone has raised concerns that this child might be developing autism. But it's certainly suggesting that those kids who end up with a diagnosis of autism may just be showing a different pattern of interests. They're more interested in patterns, in objects, than they are in people and in faces. So moving on to the psychology of autism, and again getting closer to the world of emotions, we've been very interested in looking at empathy in autistic people compared to people in the general population, and using this test which we call the eyes test, where you have to look at photographs of people's eyes to decide which of these 4 words best describes what the person in the photo is thinking or feeling. So it's an emotion recognition test. And what you can see in this graph is that women in the population score higher than men on average. So there's a sex difference in emotion recognition. Maybe I should have told you the correct answer, that here she's dispirited or a bit sad. And people with autism, both men and women, score lower than those without a diagnosis. Here you can see the bell curve of performance on this test. This test has been used in very large samples. 80,000 people have taken this test online. So we can see that there are individual differences in the ability to decode someone's facial expressions just from the information around the eyes, even in these rather low-resolution black and white fragments of the face. Clearly, we're able to pick up enough information to imagine what the person is thinking or feeling. When people are asked to do that test whilst they're having an MRI scan, so you can look at functional brain activity, what you find is that there's a part of the frontal lobe, the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is more active in women than in men whilst they're doing this test, and is underactive in autistic people whilst they're doing that same test. So this is suggesting a difficulty in emotion recognition in autistic people. Some people have interpreted this as autistic people showing an extreme of the typical male profile, because we see a gender difference in the general population, and that this is reflected by how much activity relevant parts of the brain are showing during the task. So when I said that 80,000 people had taken the eyes test, this was through a collaboration with the company 23andMe. Many of you know this personal genomics company where you pay $100 to get your genome sequenced, but you can also take tests on their website. So 80,000 people took the eyes test. Again, we're looking at a Manhattan plot, because you can then look to see if there are any common genetic variants associated with how well you score on the test. And you can see that there was this one genetic variant that crossed the red line in terms of probability significance, suggesting that there might be a partly genetic contributory factor to how well you do on that test. So, many years ago we were working with Peter Robinson's lab to also look at whether we could measure emotion recognition in autistic people. And with the then PhD student, Ofer Golan, we developed what's called the Cambridge Mind Reading Test, where we presented facial expressions of this kind. These were short video clips of facial expressions. We also had vocal intonations, so audio clips too, but I'm just going to focus on facial expressions. These are still photographs, but you click on the face and you see the person's emotions change. And then you're asked a question, which of these 4 words best describes what she is feeling? So here, I guess she's admiring. This is my best guess. And here, he's probably restless. But these are quite challenging tests because we were trying to identify subtle differences that might exist between autistic people and non-autistic people, recognizing complex emotions. Developing this test involved us identifying the full range of human emotions, and we ended up with a list of 412 human emotions with video clips of every human emotion expressed on the face of an adult, a child, male and female, people of different ethnicities and so forth. And because that was a large number of emotions, we grouped them into 24 families of emotions. You can see the list here, like the afraid family or the angry family of emotions. And in this research, we then looked to see whether autistic people were able to correctly identify different emotions from facial expressions across these different emotion groups. So these are the 24 groups of emotions, but here you see individual examples of the emotions. It's a bit difficult for you to read such a long list. But within the surprise family of emotions, there'd be one called appalled, where, can you recognize when someone is appalled? So not just happily surprised, but maybe unhappily surprised at something. And we also categorized every emotion by developmental level from 1 to 6, 1 being what you'd expect of a young child being able to recognize the emotion, 6 being an adult. So some estimate of developmental level or complexity. And what you can see just in this brief summary of the results is that the autistic group scored significantly lower than the non-autistic group in their overall score of emotion recognition. And again, a lot of detail here, but just showing the proportion of people in the autism group and the control group who were able to pick up, correctly identify each of these 20 emotions. So we just focused on 20 out of the larger number, and the little asterisk shows you which ones were significantly different between the 2 groups. So very much evidence of an empathy deficit or an emotion recognition deficit in autism, but you need really quite subtle emotional expressions in order to reveal it. The other side of autism I've already mentioned. The other side of the psychology of autism is pattern recognition. So whilst they might struggle to read faces, they might be excellent at looking at patterns and taking them apart. So this is a test where you have to find the cube as quickly as you can in the overall design. And if I use the laser pointer, you might see the front of the cube receding in 3D. I hope that helps you. Some of you might be very quick at seeing these patterns. But what you find is that autistic people, these are the average number of seconds it takes to find the cube. Autistic people are super quick and super accurate compared to typical males, who in turn are faster than typical females. So again, we're seeing a gender difference in the general population on average, and autistic people showing superior performance at pattern recognition. And when you ask people to take that test whilst they're lying in the MRI scanner, you find that males in the population show more activity in the visual cortex at the back of the brain, the posterior parietal cortex, and autistic people show even less activity in that same region, even though they're showing superior performance. So the brain seems to be, in some ways, more efficient at pattern recognition in autism. And this may give rise to individuals like this young boy, 10-year-old Max Park, who is listed amongst the top 100 Rubik Cube competitors in the world, who is autistic, but is winning these international competitions, which involves a toy, but clearly involves pattern recognition. So we've started to try and understand, is there a relationship between people who are good at pattern recognition and the number of autistic traits that you have? And we started off in this area by looking at students here in Cambridge University, looking at those who are studying sciences versus humanities, because scientists need an ability to look at patterns, whether it's numerical patterns or any other kind, to understand data. And what you can see is if you give them that measure of autistic traits, the AQ, on average, those in the sciences are showing more autistic traits than those in the humanities. So these aren't people who have autism, but it's showing that individuals in the population who might have better pattern recognition skills might also have more autistic traits. And indeed, we've done the converse. We've asked autistic kids to look at little physics problems to see how well they can perform. And what we find is that if you ask autistic kids and then non-autistic kids to look at these mechanical reasoning problems, so the wheel is going anti-clockwise and you have to predict what will happen to this point P, it's a little multiple choice test, and the correct answer is it will go back and forth. Autistic kids actually do better on these sorts of tests than non-autistic kids. So despite their difficulties in recognizing emotions on faces, for example, understanding people, they're actually outperforming non-autistic kids when it comes to understanding mechanical causality. So this made us then think about the genetics of all of this. What would we expect to find in the parents of autistic children in terms of their profile? And we looked at the proportion of fathers of autistic children working in the field of engineering, engineering being an occupation where you need good pattern recognition skills, good understanding of systems, compared to fathers of kids without autism. And you can see that fathers were overrepresented in the field of engineering, compared to fathers of autistic kids, compared to fathers of typical kids. So thinking back to the genetics where I started out this talk, we might imagine that the genes for autism, which must be coming from one or both parents, might not be genes that lead to autism, but might be genes that predispose to better understanding of systems and pattern recognition. This led to a prediction that we might expect rates of autism to vary in different parts of the world depending on the kinds of populations that we're looking at. So you might imagine that Silicon Valley in California, which attracts a lot of computer scientists and those working in information technology, there might be higher rates of autism in that area compared to other areas. We looked at the equivalent of Silicon Valley in Europe. This is in the Netherlands and particularly the city of Eindhoven, which is the sort of Silicon Valley of the Netherlands. It has the Eindhoven Institute of Technology, a bit like MIT. And it's also had the Philips factory there for over 100 years, attracting people to come and work who are gifted in electronics or technology. And we looked at autism rates there compared to two other Dutch cities, Utrecht and Haarlem, which are not IT hubs. And you can see that the autism rates were more than twice as high in Eindhoven compared to the two other Dutch cities. And finally, as a kind of proof that autistic traits seem to be associated with people who work in STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths, we gave the AQ, the Autism Spectrum Quotient, to 500,000 people online to look at whether there was any association between those working in STEM versus others. And you can see that those working in STEM, shown in red, are shifted slightly to the right on this spectrum of autistic traits compared to those who are not working in STEM. So, an interesting association to understand better. So pulling together the psychology of autism into a model, this is a way to summarize some of the data that we've seen so far, which is that we can think about autism, but we can also think about the human mind in terms of two dimensions: empathy along one dimension and systemizing along the orthogonal dimension. So if you're at 0 on either of these dimensions, it means you're average in the population. And as you go up this way, you're better at empathy, or down this way, you're below average on empathy. And as you go out to the right along the x-axis, you're above average on systemizing, or being able to understand systems or patterns. And out to the left, you're below average. And what we've been finding is that there are gender differences in the population on average. So more women or more females are scoring in this light blue zone, where their empathy is at a higher level than their systemizing. More males in the population are scoring in this pink zone, where their systemizing is at a higher level than their empathy. And autistic people seem to be down in this bottom right-hand quadrant, where their empathy is below average, but their systemizing, their ability to understand a system of patterns very quickly, might be anything from average through to superior. So maybe understanding autism should be in the context of these individual differences in these two psychological domains, empathy and systemizing, and it helps situate autism in the broader space, because we're all located somewhere in this space. And we can look at that, as we have done, by doing population studies. So we give people in the population, like you, 2 questionnaires to fill out: an empathy quotient, which asks how quickly you can pick up on other people's feelings, and a systemizing quotient, which asks how interested you are in systems, like how computers work. So here are the 2 axes, and what you can see, the dots, the yellow dots are women in the population, and they seem to be clustered up here. The green dots are males in the population, and they seem to be shifted down here. And then the purple and red dots are people on the autism spectrum who are shifted down here. So this is just eyeballing the data. And if we actually do a count, so plotting people in the population in terms of these profiles, if we look at individuals whose empathy is at a higher level than their systemizing, we find 43% of women show that profile. If we look at the opposite profile, systemizing higher than empathy, we find 53% of men, so significant sex differences. And if we look to see where are the majority of autistic people, they're showing an extreme of this, where their empathy is below average, but their systemizing is at least average, if not superior. So a bigger discrepancy between their empathy and their systemizing. So the last part of the talk, I want to talk about intervention, and particularly affective computing as an intervention. Sometimes parents ask me, if I have an autistic child, what should I be doing for my child? What is recommended? What does the evidence show that would be helpful? This is an intervention that comes from UCLA. It's called JASPER, but it focuses on play with a therapist or with a parent, but where you're trying to cultivate what's called joint attention. So the JA stands for joint attention, where the parent or the therapist is really trying to encourage the child to jointly attend to an activity. So you introduce the toy, it doesn't really matter what it is, but the key focus of the therapy is a lot of experience in establishing joint attention so that the child and the adult both realize they're both looking at the same thing. And that's forming a social connection between the child and another person. And what you can see is that with the opportunity to take part in this intervention, those who have the intervention show an increase in their social engagement compared to those autistic children who don't go through that therapy. So that's suggesting that a very social, direct social contact kind of intervention, early intervention, might make a difference. A second kind of intervention is one that we developed here in Cambridge, which we call Lego clubs. So we take autistic children who seem to love patterns and building things with Lego, but often they're doing it alone in their bedrooms. We bring them to a Lego club, usually at school, so it's non-stigmatizing. Any kid can come and play Lego, but now they're using their good pattern recognition skills in a social context. They're playing Lego with other children. And what we find is that autistic children who attend the Lego clubs show an increase in their communication skills compared to those who don't go through the intervention, shown in yellow here. The other group shown on the graph are people who are going through a different intervention, a speech and language therapy, which also shows benefits. So these interventions are not unique. Many different kinds of interventions will show a benefit for autistic kids. But this is a nice example of where you're taking the autistic child's areas of strength, in this case pattern recognition, Lego, and you're using it to help them with their area of disability, communication and socializing, to make them feel confident. They know how to do Lego, but to use it in a social context. So what about affective computing? So going back to the electronic collection of emotions that we created, we called it mind reading, where we had these 412 emotions validated and expressed as video clips by actors. You can see some of the examples of the emotions expressed on male and female faces, adults and children, people of different ethnicities. We gave these emotions to autistic adults and children so that they could study emotions in an electronic format, so they could play the emotions on their computer. So whereas the rest of us might learn emotion recognition by playing with our brothers and sisters or playing with our friends in the playground, and we kind of learn to recognize emotions without really understanding how we do it, clearly autistic kids need a bit more help, and so we're giving them emotional expressions on the computer so that they can play them over and over again, they can repeat it, they can learn it, much like you would with learning a foreign language. And what we found was that autistic people, this was an adult study by Ofer Golan, improved in emotion recognition from faces. They also had the opportunity to listen to audio clips of emotional information in voices. You can see that they improve in that too, compared to a non-intervention group, shown in pink. The yellow dot shows typical performance. So the intervention group in blue are improving, but they're not catching up to typical levels, but nevertheless showing that with an opportunity to learn, maybe using a format that they feel most comfortable with, which is learning through computers, they can learn to improve in their emotion recognition skills. And this isn't anything magical. We're not talking about a cure or anything. We're simply saying that, like any skill, emotion recognition can improve with practice. So we've got Rosalind Pickard here, but the group at MIT Media Lab, including Rana El-Kalioubi, who was here in Cambridge maybe 20 years ago, have also pursued this very important area of whether we can use affective computing as an intervention in autism. I'm just going to highlight some of the ideas that were being developed maybe about 10 years ago, but I hope that there's more of an update coming. Because this was an attempt to see whether computers could recognize some of the stimuli that we used in the mind-reading DVD, and in particular using what today we would call machine learning methods. Could a computer identify different features in emotional expressions? And here they were just looking at a small number of emotions, I think 6 different emotions, finding that computers could find their way through the complex characteristics of different emotions to assign a probability of saying, yes, this is likely to be concentrating or agreeing or disagreeing or interested and so forth. So the idea was that maybe there might be wearable devices where the person could get feedback from a computer looking at someone else's face saying, the person in front of me is disagreeing or the person in front of me is interested, if the autistic person had difficulty in reading faces. I think this is a kind of promising direction. I'd be very interested to hear later in the conference if this line of work has been pursued and if it's found to be acceptable by autistic people in terms of wearing these devices, and if the accuracy is improving in terms of being able to give rapid feedback to the autistic person. This was another kind of interesting idea at the time. This is going back to 2006, I think, of wearable devices, but where a little camera is looking at the person's face to give them feedback, and the computer can give them feedback on the emotional expression that they are showing to an audience. So again, sort of allowing a level of self-monitoring or becoming more aware, so increasing awareness of one's own facial expressions and how they might be perceived by someone that you're interacting with. So I think these were all very, novel, pioneering ideas, and I'd be very interested to know how they have played out in the subsequent decade. The other approach we took to teaching emotion recognition using affective material was to create, again, another DVD, but this was an animation. We call it the Transporters, so I'm just showing you a still picture. But these were like children's movies, little 5-minute animations, a bit like Thomas the Tank Engine. So each character in the story is a vehicle, like a train or a tram or a cable car or a tractor, because autistic people often love to look at mechanical objects, particularly those that are moving down tracks or moving down cables, so they have limited degrees of freedom. They're very predictable. And what we were doing was putting emotional expressions from actors, human actors, onto the front of the vehicles, so that as they were watching the wheels going round or the vehicle moving down tracks, they were also seeing characters with faces, human faces, changing according to what was happening in the story. And this was targeted at very young autistic children. And the idea was, if you try to give them social skills in a very obvious way, they might find it overwhelming, they might not want to participate. But if you introduce emotions in this more mechanical context, they might be more interested to watch the material, and they might pick up important social information without realizing it. And that's exactly what we found, that those autistic children who watched the DVD for 15 minutes a day over a 1-month period increased in their emotion recognition skills compared to a non-intervention group, shown in pink here. And actually, very strikingly, the autistic children who watched the animations caught up to typical levels in as short a period as 1 month. So this was just on a particular test of emotion recognition. Again, it doesn't mean that they are no longer autistic, because as we saw from the beginning of my talk, autism is part of your identity, it's part of your genetics. That's not going to change, but part of what these tools could do is help the child to understand or recognize emotions if they're having difficulties with that. So techniques for supporting the disability if they want to learn to improve in it. I'm going to finish just with, I think, a very revolutionary concept that many of you will have heard about called neurodiversity. Perhaps I should have started with this at the beginning of the talk, but this is the idea that there are many different types of brains in the population. So we're very familiar with biodiversity, how important it is that we maintain the richness of biodiversity. And the same may be true for neurodiversity. There are many different kinds of brains, even in this room. Some more social, some more oriented towards patterns, and so forth. And that the autistic community produced this poster, which is really asking for acceptance, not to pathologize or stigmatize people who have autism, but just acceptance of this diversity, and saying we are different, but we're not less, we're not inferior. So when we're thinking about, this is an ethical point to finish my talk, when we're thinking about affective computing for autistic people, clearly this should just be an option. Parents may opt to try the new technologies that come along. Autistic adults may opt to use it because they want to improve their social skills, for example. But we shouldn't sort of prejudge individuals who are different and assume that they want to change. It should be very much a matter of choice. So I'm going to finish there, thank the funders of our research, and thank you for your attention.